So let's look at pathologies in skin, and we're going to add on to our knowledge of basic skin terminology. Remember last lesson we looked at how to use roots, prefixes, and suffixes to describe signs and symptoms of different skin conditions. And now what we're going to do is learn to grade different lesions. And for our purposes, a lesion is going to be any kind of abnormality in skin, and that could be something genetically derived, or an illness, or an injury. And what we're going to focus on is differences in size, in shape, in color, and then in filling. So let's look at some common roots and suffixes that are going to be helpful for you to create terms to describe different skin conditions. So in addition to the color terms that I gave you last lesson, look at the following. You have terms to describe nails. Pyo will be used frequently, so pus. Sclero, so hardening of the skin. Rhytido means wrinkle. Leuco means white, so yet another color term. And then some interesting suffixes like discharge or rhea. From our previous unit. Ectomy, again, from our previous unit, is a good treatment term. Genic will be used usually in combination with pyo, so like pyogenic, pus-producing, or rhytidogenic, wrinkle-producing. And phagia, which is used to describe eating, so things like phagocytic cells, are cells that eat other dead cells or necrotic cells and tissues, and as well as bacteria. And we saw those in the inflammation unit. And ia denotes any kind of infection that is brewing in skin, or any abnormal kind of condition. So add these to your list of terms and mix and match to describe various conditions, along with our classifications for little lesions, large lesions, and then wound terms. So we're going to start with wound terms. One root that I want to add in before we get to wound terms is fungus, and that is the root myco. And mycosis would be an abnormal fungal condition. These are two really common funguses or fungi that we see in human populations. The first is a zoonotic disease. So it comes from animals typically, and then it's passed along to people. So if you have a shelter dog or a cat, when you bring them home, oftentimes they might be coming home with Tinea capitis, which is ringworm. And you can see that on animals by seeing that their skin looks kind of dusty and flaky and is thin and lacking in hair in certain regions, and they might be a little bit itchy. And you might think that that was fleas, but really it's a fungal infection. And what we can see is a hair loss patch that's kind of circular. In humans, it's easier without the hair to see the ring that gives it its name, ringworm. So it's not a worm at all. It's really just a fungal infection. But those fungi spread out into a ring shape. So if you've ever been walking around in the field or a forest and you've seen a fairy ring of mushrooms growing in a really large circle, it's very common for fungi to start in a central location and then to radiate out as they grow, and they create these rings. And so around the crust here is where the spores will open, and that's where it's usually the itchiest. We break the skin by scratching, and then kind of pus and spores spew forth and then can be grabbed underneath the nails or spread via clothes or contact to other areas of the skin. A close cousin is Tinea pedis, which is athlete's foot. So it's really very, very, very similar. Difference being that Tinea pedis originates in human populations, is passed from person to person, typically through wet showers, gym equipment, that sort of stuff. So always wear protective footgear in public showers, and make sure that you wipe down equipment very well. And dry and aerate skin-like areas in the feet, between toes, underneath armpits, waistbands, those sorts of places tend to be great places to cultivate fungi. because just like mushrooms in the forest, they like to live and thrive in wet, dark, moist, warm areas. And this is what it can create. So this is an example of Tina pedis after it's progressed, and you can see that it becomes really red, itchy, purulent pus kind of discharge in between the toes, peeling of the skin. So you could probably come up with a couple of different terms from your roots, prefixes, and suffixes to describe these conditions. So think about the white, flaky skin or the scaliness. Think about the pus production. Think about the itchiness. Think about the redness. Think about the fact that this is all abnormally caused by some sort of a fungus, and come up with 4 to 5 terms to describe what you would see from this patient. Right? This is exactly why we come up with these terms, so that we can describe our patient's conditions. Okay, so we're going to get into lesions, the large and the small. And as I said, think about whether or not they are flat or raised, so their shape, their size, their color, and what is in the center. And you will be completing your own table that will be used as a reference for future patient problems. One of the first pathologies we're going to look at is a fissure, which is just basically a crack. So we're going to see those mainly in areas where we're going to see very dry skin. So think of calloused heels, calluses, calloused fingertips. If you have very, very, very dry skin, the integrity of the epidermis can break down, and under strain or pressure, they can rupture or break apart. And so those are cracks. So they're dry, cracked lesions. Lacerations are going to be kind of like fissures, but they're going to be wet. So these are going to be wounds that are formed from some sort of tear or a cut. So if you cut yourself with a knife, or you cut yourself on a tree branch as you're walking through the woods, cat scratch, all of those are examples of lacerations. They're jagged, torn wounds. And this doesn't look very jagged, but everything on a microscopic scale is going to look like a jagged wound, unless we're looking at something that is surgically cut, with those blades being so sharp and fine that they make a very clean incision, as opposed to a cut, which is a laceration. And then finally, we have sores, right? Any kind of open sore, whether it's external to the body or even internal, like so inside the mouth or the stomach, is called an ulcer. So we're going to replace the word sore in our vocabulary to use ulcer instead. And finally, when those sores cover over and attempt to heal, they are covered over not with a scab, but we're going to start calling those crusts. So every time we see the word crust, we know that that means some sort of initial healing and covering over an open ulcer or sore or wound. Okay, so those are your basic terms that we're going to look at to start us off with pathologies. In our next section, we'll look at little lesions.